Sure, let's get started then. I am Maria Jackson. I'm at NAU. I'm the program manager for the Partnership for Native American Cancer Prevention, and my counterpart, Maria Pravat at U of A, will continue on with our presentation, but I'll get started here. So this is all about budgets, and Maria, do you want to go ahead and proceed to the next slide there? So just getting started here. So a big part of the budgets is we really need to carefully read your funding announcement. In there, you'll see your period of support, the number of years that you are allowed to put a budget in for, and then just keeping that in the back of your mind as you're writing your research proposal and strategizing. I'm not going to need a consultant the first year, but I'll probably need one in the second year. Or we're going to be doing research and have participants, and we're going to need incentives or gift cards in years 3 and 4. Just keeping that in the back of your mind as you're strategizing each year for your period of support. Another big thing in your funding announcements is the dollar limits. And we'll go into this more detailed, but they talk about total costs versus direct costs. So just keeping in mind what that means. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but just like I said, carefully reading those funding announcements, knowing your period of support, knowing your dollar limits, and then the types of budgets. So it'll indicate in that announcement whether or not you have a modular budget or a detailed budget. And the basic difference between those is modular is more like lumping 10,000 for travel, 5,000 for other expenses, whereas a detailed will ask you for very itemized. I will be taking these 3 trips. They're each going to cost X amount, and it requires a little bit more detailed information. So the type of budget will indicate, will be indicated in your funding announcement. Another big thing in there is whether there's a requirement for prior approvals and different updates. So if you're responding to a funding announcement that's been out, redone multiple times, it'll also have in there whether or not there's updates. A big thing too is you need to know your limits, spending caps, expense limits, those will all be in your funding announcements. What are some unallowable expenses? So I know like some of the training grants will only allow a certain percentage of F&A. So that needs to be kind of indicated, that is indicated in your funding announcement. So just know your limits. Identify what is necessary and reasonable. So it's very important that you're providing a clear rationale for your requested budget. And you want to avoid overestimating or even underestimating your proposed work. So and a lot of times you think, oh, I only need 10% of my time. When really, let's just be honest, it's going to take 15% of your time. Or it's going to be more in the summer, less in the academic year, or vice versa. So it's just really important to trying to, as you're strategizing, keep those things in mind. You should know that some of the things that NIH and NCI look for is when you put in a large request for new equipment, that kind of suggests that there's an insufficient environment at your institution to be able to accommodate this work. So if you need to justify that piece of equipment. There needs to be a great rationale for grant support for each of the individuals on your budget. So those are all things to keep in mind when you're starting to think about your budget, when you're writing your research proposal. And those are just my initial tips just to keep in mind as you're going forward. Next slide. So like I said, there's 2 major types of budgets here. There's the modular form, which are typically done with R01s and R21s. And these are for less than direct costs annually for $250,000. There's the detailed budgets, which are more of the itemized type budgets. And they are required for your fellowship applications, your K awards, your training awards, and such as in our NACP multi-project research grants as well, so the U54s. Next slide. So let's talk direct costs. So direct costs, if it says direct costs in the funding announcement, that's just the stuff, those are just the costs associated directly to the grant. Whereas F&A, which is your facility and administrative costs, those are what it costs the institution to kind of house the grant. So that's kind of what NAU, U of A charges the NCI or NIH to house that grant. So you have your direct cost, you have your indirect costs, and if you add them together, you have your total costs. And at NAU, the current federally negotiated rate for organized research is 52%. And at U of A, the cancer centers is 53.5%. So when you're thinking about the budget components and you're thinking about, okay, how do I differentiate this? You just have to look at your FOA and it'll tell you whether or not that's total costs, which you need to pull out what the indirect would be for your institution, or if they just state what the direct costs are, and then they sometimes won't even, there'll be indications in some, I believe, training awards where it's like you can't exceed 8% of indirects and that sort of thing. So it's just very important to go back to your funding announcement, but this is kind of a breakdown of what the direct costs are, what the indirect costs / facility administrative costs are, and then what total costs are. Next slide. All right, so now you're into your budget components. So there's section A and B, which is your personnel. And within that, each listed individual in your budget should have a specific role on the project. You need to be realistic. And I always say that because we always have this idea that you have more than 100% of your time. You have all kinds of time. So just be really realistic on how much time it's going to take to accomplish the necessary research within that what you're putting in for. You need to explain any fluctuations in effort levels. So like I said, you're going to have a postdoc and you're going to hire them, and they're not going to start on the very first day. They're going to start 3 months in after you conduct a search. So just keeping that in mind, that you're only asking for 9 months of support in that first year, that will save you some money there that you could put towards something else. So that's a good strategy to keep in mind. Also, that in this, so you would have to justify that. So the first year there was only 9 months for that postdoc, but in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, that postdoc is there at 12 months. So then you can account for that. So just not just with postdocs, but with students, with bringing on an administrative or a coordinator person. It takes time to hire them, and to just keep that in mind. And make sure you explain those fluctuation of efforts, because it might be that the research doesn't require that you have to do any consultant work until years 3 and 4. So then those fluctuations would be increased in years 3 and 4 for the consultant that you have all listed. Keeping in mind person months. So that's always hard to calculate, because I know that everyone has different appointments, whether it's a 12-month appointment, like at the U of A, many individuals have 12-month appointments, or at NAU where we have a 9-month appointment with summer salary of 3 months, and just kind of making sure that you are detailed on how much time you're spending on this, whether it's academic versus calendar versus summer. You want to make sure you have your qualified individuals, whether they're listed as investigators, technicians, postdoc fellows, undergraduate and graduate students, and how much time dedicated for each. So that would be sections A and B in personnel. And Maria and I are resources if you guys need help with that, if you guys need to help determine what kind of contract this individual's on. They're in a completely different department, and coordinating with them. So those are some good questions to ask. The next section is the equipment section. And equipment is defined as having a cost more than $5,000, or a service life that's long. It has to be longer than a year, because if your service life is less than a year, then it should fall under supplies. So like I said, the $5,000 for the service life. This, when you're calculating the F&A, we have to remove this from the base. So you do not get indirects off of equipment that's purchased, or the university does not get indirects based off of that. Most equipment, when you purchase it, you want to buy it in the first year of the grant. That way it looks like you're utilizing it for all all the years of your grant life there. And it's important to consider that in your equipment, when you purchase it, there's also maintenance agreements associated with that. So a lot of times we buy this piece of equipment, it says, oh, the first 2 years is covered maintenance agreement, but what about the last 3 years? So it's very important that you keep that in mind we're going to put it in the other direct costs for years 3, 4, and 5, but it's also important to just kind of keep that in mind. Justification is always required for equipment, and you should consider putting a price quote for that equipment within the application. And then, like I said, the maintenance agreements for the later years is also important. You can move on to section D, which is travel. And this is travel associated with your research project. It can consist of like data collection or access to resources such as, oh, I need to go down to the U of A and use this very specific piece of equipment. So I need to travel down there. I need funds for that. That could also be included. Also, you should include travel for professional development. So conferences within your area of research or presentations that you can give on your research at the conference. This should also, you should justify, you should clearly state how the travel is related to your aims and the goals of the proposed research, and also consider travel for community dissemination of research results. We have lodging, transportation, and meals would all be based on the institutional's policy. So that may differ both at NAU or U of A or how we count that. But so that's all that you should include in travel, some considerations. Section E at NAU, we don't use it too often, but I know that U of A does for participant and trainee support costs. Those costs should be put into this section. I believe that they utilize it for some students participant costs. And so that's section E for the most part. Unless it's stated in the FOA, we don't typically utilize it on the NAU side. Section F is other direct costs. So this is just like an estimate of materials and supplies needed for the personnel that's going to be working on your research. So animal intensive studies, studies involving human subjects, extensive bioinformatics expenses, publication costs are getting really expensive. So it's so important to make sure you have that included. And whether that's not in your first year, but maybe it's in years 4 and 5. So just keeping that strategy in place where you're like, I want to include publication costs, especially with the online option and everything. I mean, we're looking at like $3,000, $4,000 right now in the last couple that we've been doing. Shared facility fees. This would also include consortium and subcontracts section in this other direct cost section F. Make sure you get these in prior approval because they do require prior approval. So that means that it needs to be approved by our funding agency before we can continue with that. And I know Maria is going to talk more in depth about subcontracts later in the presentation. Business meals, that's a huge one, especially at NAU. NAU will not reimburse for business meals unless it's in your budget. And I'm pretty sure that's the same for U of A. But if you're anticipating meeting with the community and providing some kind of refreshments, make sure it's written in to your budget under this section. Gift cards and incentives. I kind of talked about that before, but the requirements to get both of these at the universities require logs and prior approval. So, you know, the earlier you have that in your budget and approved and justified on why it's needed, the smoother sailing it is to, you know, facilitate that at both institutions. Next slide. So these are just a couple of like budget errors that I have seen firsthand for both of us at both universities. Some of the bigger ones, like I said, is exceeding your FOA budget amount, the funding announcement amount. And that is just happens sometimes when you're moving funds around and then all of a sudden when you hit that submit, it calculates it and it's more than what you thought it was, what it was allowed. So that gives you an error and it won't let you submit sometimes. So that's something to consider. The budget request did not include F&As. I've seen that before. And I've seen it where a research project has been funded, but did not put in for their indirects for their F&As, and then they have to reduce their budget in order to accommodate the F&As at both institutions. And that could really deter a research project, especially for their scope of work and everything. The costs on the budget differ from the justification. So when you're submitting it, you'll see that you'll 10 key, you'll be typing in the budget in the system, but then the justification just gets attached as a PDF. And there are times where you've made so many adjustments that maybe you didn't accurately put it on your budget justification correctly, and they don't match. And then you hear about that. So that's another error that I've seen. Salaries exceeding the NIH salary cap. The current cap is $212,100. So if you are calculating your effort, your ERE effort, your effort, you have to keep in mind that if your salary or anyone on your project salary exceeds that, you cannot go over that $212,100. Calendar months don't equate to what's the requested salary. So that can get kind of hairy when you're calculating, like I said, different appointments, whether it's 12-month, 9-month appointments, and trying to calculate those your efforts there so that it matches what the requested salary is. Like I said, a miscalculation of F&A, whether it's higher or lower. You absolutely have to include gift cards in the budget request initially. And say you didn't do it for that first year. Well, maybe you can hold off till the second year, and then in your RPPR, when you're doing your progress report, you can add that in at that point. There's no way you, like within the, once you've already been funded, it's not like you're set there. You can make those adjustments mid-grant cycle. The travel budget did not include foreign travel. So I am guilty of that just this year. I was not aware that NAU counts Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico as foreign travel, even though they are part of the United States. Apparently, you have to have a travel line in order to reimburse. And we had a group of students that went to Puerto Rico, and we ran into this because I did not have a foreign travel line in our budget, because I did not realize that that's how NAU calculates it with the travel line over here. Or the budget request did not include a subcontract. And like I said, Maria is going to go into more detail about that, but it's so important to have that prior approval. It's so important to have a letter of support from your subcontract. It's so important to also have a conversation with them that they're even on this, because I've had instances where we start a subcontract process and the entity was not aware, or maybe that individual who was at that entity has left since because it's been such a long lead time there. So that's something also to consider. Next slide. And in the budget justification, so this is that PDF that you submit that goes in with the budget. Make sure you briefly describe each role in the project, each individual's role. And this is a good place to add more information about everybody's role, especially if you have page limits in your research proposal plan. So I say take advantage of it. There's no page limit on the budget justification. So I say go to town on everyone's role there. And especially if that means that you have more space in your actual proposal plan, research plan. Justifying your graduate assistant, what they're going to be doing, who they're going to be reporting to, what they're going to be responsible for, indicating the stipend and the tuition remission and insurance costs that are associated with that, because I know it's different at each institution. Consultants, it's best to itemize those costs and whether or not they include travel, because a lot of consultants will be, this is my hourly rate, or this is like, or if it's based on completion of X, Y, and Z. Make sure you get that into the justification so that we know how to go forward with requesting payment for them. It's also, like I said, including travel. If they're going to be traveling, are we including their travel? Are we going to be paying for their hotels if they come into town, like that sort of thing? That all needs to go into the consultant line, because that gets paid separately than travel. Equipment, like I said, you may need an equipment quote on that. And supplies and materials. It's best to kind of itemize as much as you can. and break them into subcategories. Aim 1 requires all of these pipettes and blah, 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 like that kind of stuff. Aim 2 requires community dissemination, and I need to have, what are those things called when you put the tent up? We need research materials for that, and just that sort of thing. So just make sure you kind of itemize it as best you can. Travel, itemize the cost of each trip. So you can differentiate between conference travel, field work, research dissemination, meeting with community members, that sort of thing. Just a lump amount for each one, itemizing them. Subaward will also, you need to have a budget and budget justification for your subawardee. They're going to require that, a whole separate budget for just the subawardee. Other costs would be such as food, meals, publication expenses, incentives, and yeah, that's all I got for budget justification. Now I'll turn it over to Maria to continue with our presentation.
Well, first I'm going to unmute. So I'm going to continue with this, and we're going to get to the point where you've actually got the award. And so, yeah, you got the award. There's lots of things for you guys to consider. We're just going to focus on the financial part and how you manage the budget and things to consider moving forward. Before I go on, I'm just going to say a lot of you that are listening to this are guides. So any of this that doesn't make sense, or Maria and I are here to facilitate that, and especially through the guides shared resource. So, you know, like setting up a subcontract, I'll go into it a little bit, but, you know, there are details. It just takes a few times. We've done it. And so we can help facilitate that. So, you know, that's what we're here for. And that's why we, you know, do the shared resource. So, okay, yeah, you got the award, and, you know, this, maybe you heard before, but you finally get your notice of award. And that notice of award usually comes through an email that whoever the signing official was at the institution puts in an email. It comes there, or you will be able to find it on your EAR Commons under the status bar. Okay, so like everything else, review that award statement, read the whole document. There are a lot of things in there. It looks like it's a lot of like just jargon that's put in and everything, but there are details in there that you're going to want to know about. And if you don't, could cause problems down the line. So compare the dollar amounts to your original budget submissions. Many grants, especially in the first year, are cut somewhere between 2 to 16%. And that's something to consider, just backing up a little bit, when you're making your budget. When you're originally submitting your budget, think about where you might have some wiggle room. If we got to cut, you know, where could I cut? So that you don't lock yourself up too much in a certain category. So on this slide, this little square here is what is, as of October 2020, started seeing these on the notice of award. And it's actually, this is just a piece of that front page, but now the front pages are sort of standardized for notice of awards. And that's just so that they look sort of the same across all the HHS systems. But on here, this little, it's kind of a box in that, on that first page. And you'll, it shows the budget period, start date, end date. What's the amount of direct cost that was awarded, as well as the total, the indirect costs. If it's not your first year, it's possible that it'll have the amount of carryover that you've been authorized to have on there that you requested, and we'll talk about carryover a little bit later. This is a line that sometimes we don't know where it comes from, and it's called the offset. So these are unspent funds in a prior budget period. And I will tell you, what we have seen is that sometimes it's not just the year before, it was the year before that, 2 years before. But basically it was an amount that went unobligated, went unspent. And so that goes, it replaces new funds on your award. So it's not on top of it. Now you basically, you have that amount that was unspent, but now that was taken away from your current year. So hopefully that makes sense. So it's important to know because you might not have known that you had that. So it's real careful. I mean, if you've done, we're going to talk about the management. If you've done really good budget management, you'll know it. You'll be like, oh, yeah, there it is. We didn't spend that amount. And so they're taking it off this year. Other parts of the notice of award will have not only this initial budget period, but also amounts for subsequent years. Okay. Super important. Check for restrictions. It's a section called Section 4, and it's the award conditions section. This can affect how your funds are used, how the timing of when the funds can be used, and basically how the funds can be spent. And I'll give you an example. We've had restrictions once we had, so ours is NACP is a multiple project grant, and one of the projects didn't have IRB funding. So we were restricted from using any of the funding for that project. So we had to be very careful that nothing was coming out of there until they got their IRB funding. And then, they gave us a certain amount of time to go back and check and do that. The other one was we requested carry forward, and we requested several things that we would do with that carry forward fund. And the restriction only allowed one of those items. So, if you don't know that, then you're off spending it on everything you put in. So check restrictions, super important. Later, again, in the notice of award, and these are several pages long, but they will do a breakdown of your direct costs by category, unless it's, as Maria talked about, a module, which usually you don't have that same breakdown. But if it's if it was a detailed budget, you're going to see the categories. They're going to, how much you put in for salary, how much you were awarded, for salary, for fringe benefits, for personnel, et cetera. So that's all really important to when you're looking at where you might have gotten cut. You do have rebudgeting flexibility with most grants. You have a certain amount of latitude to rebudget within each of those categories and also across the categories. A lot of times you'll hear sort of that 25%. Don't rebudget over 25% within a category that raises some approvals that you'll need if you have to do that. And, that has come into play with a lot of grants in the past few years because they put in for travel and then didn't use travel because of COVID, right? Everything went Zoom and people weren't traveling. Now you had this big chunk, but you were exceeding, you wanted to move it to another category, but you can't move greater than 25% without getting some sort of approval. So, just knowing what those amounts approved in case you have to make some changes. Some changes, again, are at your discretion. You can do it. Others require prior written approval. And your notice of award should show you what those should outline what those rebudgeting restrictions are. If not, then, and you're not sure, you go to grants management or program officer. Grants management, that individual's name is on your notice of award. They're strictly just about your financial part of your grant. I recommend that whenever you contact grants management, you also copy your program officer or program director, given, if you have a good relationship with them, especially that keeps them in the know. They don't always, your program director doesn't always know all the budgeting side of it, but it helps them communicate with the grants management. And they come to a little bit, I've seen better understanding if they're both involved. You get this notice of award, accept this notice of award as soon as you draw funds. If you cannot accept this award, you need to let them know right away, and that is your grants management officer, that something's wrong and you can't accept that. Don't touch the funds, obviously, until you're sure you want to move forward. If things happen, significant impacts on the award, such as changes in the PI, changes in appointments, or maybe institution affiliations, those are things that you have to let your sponsor know before moving forward, so that, or if you're in the middle of it, so you've already spent some funds, you can still, but you need to let them know. Again, also any adverse conditions that are happening that you're not able to meet the objective. So you need to communicate with your grants management person. And of course, like I said, always include your program officer. You can get revised notice of awards. At NICP, we've gotten them for mostly when we've had a change in our PIs, not our project leaders, but the actual principal investigators, the MPI. So any change like that's going to trigger a revised notice of award. Again, you get a new one, check it over, make sure everything else is change, or everything else stays the same. You just want the change in the PI name. But that's important. Sometimes the U of A is pretty good about prompting it, but sometimes they don't know that you've changed the PI. It's something that you've gotten approved by your program director, but you didn't. So you should go through the appropriate channels, but just make sure you have a notice of award that has the correct PI on there. If you do some revisions of your budget, that does not trigger a revised notice of award. If you decide to spend funds prior to your notice of award, you can be at risk of having to cover those in other ways. So make sure that your start date is when you start spending. I did have some discussions, went to a workshop myself, and they did talk about being able to charge some things, but it's kind of dicey. So it's best to just know that you're at risk if you've incurred any cost prior to the issue of your notice award or the start date, then you are at risk of having to cover it in another way. So you've looked at your notice of award, you've noticed some changes. Make yourself your own post-award budget. Just simple Excel sheet, and consider the cuts. What do you have to do if you have change in personnel? So from the time that you submitted the grant to the time that you actually got this money, you could be working with a different student, you could be working with a different technician. Maybe you have to hire somebody like Maria talked about. So you'll consider all that in your post-award budget. Maybe you got to go down from you thought you were going to hire them at the start, you haven't hired them, so you're going to back down to that 9 months like she talked about, or whatever it is going to take you. So those are things to change around in your post-award budget. Once you have that set and it matches the numbers on the notice of award, then you're going to contact Sponsored Project to load your post-award budget. That has to be done in the UA system. Most of the UA departments have like a middle person, an accountant, or someone that will assist you with this. Again, if you guys get an award outside of NICP, we're happy to help you make these contacts and make sure this gets done. Things to make sure as well. Make sure subcontracts are ready to go. Maria talked about this. Subcontracts take a very long time. There's a lot of correspondence between the two institutions. Some institutions are very familiar doing subcontracts. Sometimes it's done for the first time. They don't understand. Sometimes, it happens a lot with our community partners. They're not used to what a grant year is, or why does it matter that, the money's going to stop on August 31st, right? So There's a lot of negotiation back and forth, paperwork that has to be filled out. It's best if you can do that before. Now it's your first year of your subcontract. I know even with community partners, it's hard to say, hey, we might have this, can we set this contract up, but we might not get awarded. If you're not able to do it, you need to get going on it as soon as possible. It takes a long time and you could miss some chunks of time to do research that involves your subcontract. I recommend regular invoicing the subcontract. So a monthly invoice from them keeps them on track, keeps you on track, even if they didn't do anything that month, and the university knows nothing was charged, or there was a lot. So, and we can help with the subcontracts. It differs from, can't really go into the nitty gritty because it really differs depending on who who's your partner there. Consultants, paying consultants stipends or honorariums. At the U of A, unless they're already in the system as a vendor, as a business, you're going to need an independent contractor form. Okay, so think of this as anybody, and this happens a lot in our NACP grants, advisory board members, you want to pay them. We need to get an icon form in the system. If we can get it before the grant comes, that's great. We do that. If you're going to pay them multiple times in a year, that can be done with one icon form. Only thing is, every year you got to do a new one for them, even if it's the same individual, even if now they're in the system, doesn't matter. New year, new icon form. And just like everything else, this can take several weeks. And it's been really frustrating. Sometimes we don't know, projects are using a consultant or an advisor. They want to pay an honorarium and we can't just like pay it and then it's in there, sent to them the next week. It doesn't, it takes several weeks. So try to get as much of that done ahead of time as possible. The other thing is to talk to these subcontracts and consultants prior to getting funded. When you're putting in the grants, and one way is to get letters of support from them. That ensures that everybody knows they are on board. Also, let them know how they're going to be paid, especially consultants. Some consultants can't take an honorarium or a stipend because their employer won't allow them to. We had this happen with our diversity supplement. So, some of our advisory committee members, they can take a honorarium, some cannot. So you want to talk to them ahead of time because you want to know a way to compensate them if you can't, just pay a certain amount of money. And I know Francine, she's got some really great ideas. She does some, even for some of her community individuals, that she does food boxes. So there are creative ways to do this if, they can't just take the money. And also, if you're going to get reimbursement for them, travel and meals, you need the receipts. You're going to need all their receipts, and best to let them know again ahead of time that you're going to need that. And also, if it is meals can't have alcohol charges on them. Another budget management issue are gift cards. At the U of A, it's a pretty long process, and on what I've seen Maria go through, it's a pretty long process at NAU too. I think it's sort of similar, but I'll go through the U of A. The U of A requires that you request an advance. So I want to buy 10 gift cards because we're going to an event and I'm hoping to get some participants. So you have to put in for an advance to buy those cards. You go and get those cards with that advance. You have a specific amount of time to return a form for those gift cards that has who you distributed the gift cards to. You'll need signatures from the recipient. I know during COVID, there was some exceptions for that they were able to mail them, etc. But you're going to have some paperwork that says you did indeed give it to them. And that needs to be submitted by a certain time period to the U of A. Otherwise, you're on the hook for all that was unused and undocumented gift cards. So they will come back and take the whatever funds they had given you that appeared to be unused, and you may be stuck with, 5 gift cards to Amazon or whatever you chose to give them. So as I mentioned, getting letters of support for subcontracts and consultants ahead of time just gets them in the loop before, and makes it a little bit easier because it means you've actually had that conversation with them. Another thing that comes up in budget management, when you get your notice of award, like I said, sometimes there's been this huge gap, and now all of a sudden you realize you want a graduate student on there. You didn't have them before. So that's really not going to be possible, because graduate students, it's a much bigger process. And a lot of their expenses are not, there's no indirects collected off them. So that is not allowable to do after the fact. If you did budget one and you no longer need one, that's going to change your calculations, because again, indirect costs were not taken out. So it's just something to consider. It happens because of the gap in time. So just try to err on the side of having them in there if you think there's a possibility you're going to include graduate students. I recommend that you try to keep your own accounting. I've noticed this just in the Cancer Center in general now, but there's quite a bit of lag between what the institution thinks was spent and what you think was spent. And so if you can do as much as your own accounting, you might not go down to the nitty-gritty for personnel, but your operations costs, your travel, all of that. So you have a good grasp on where you are on your budget. It's recommended that you try to spend 75% of your funds before you submit your RPPR. So that's your progress report that goes to NIH sponsors. And on that report, it's going to ask you, will you have greater than 5% to carry over? So if you've spent down 75% and you're not going to spend any more, well, you know where you're at. But if you've spent 75%, you think, okay, in this last 6 weeks or so, I'm going to do, the 25%, at least you can say no to that. Like, well, I'm not going to have greater than 25%. Again, 25% is like sort of that buzz word that says, or buzz amount that says, that you got more than you needed. So you want to spend down. When you do the timelines for your grant, account for manuscripts. As Maria noted, they're super expensive. You want to be able to use your funds from your grants to pay for your manuscripts. You don't want to finish your work on the last day of your grant and then you haven't submitted your manuscript. So try to plan your manuscript throughout the life of the grant. That's much better anyway, but as far as funding goes, that's helpful. Now, I will put in 2 cents for those of you that are GUIDES recipients. Please keep in mind that we can help you with those manuscripts. So you've come to the end of your project and you need funds to support your manuscript. We can definitely take a look and see if we can support you on that. So last minute spending should be avoided. The U of A, and I'm not sure about NAU, Maria, but if you're spending big amounts that last month, you're going to get audited for all that's spent that last month. So all of a sudden you realize you have all this, so you start buying things. They're going to, at the end of the grant, they're going to come back and say, why did you spend? You have to give justification for that. So try to avoid last minute spending. Okay, finally, carry forward or carry over, whichever term you want to use. That's unobligated funds that were left over in the budget period that you want to carry over to the next budget period. Some grants it's automatic. You have automatic carryover authority like K awards, but that is not true for a lot of other ones. A lot of other ones, you need prior approval before you can use carryover funds. So your notice of award will usually specify whether you need prior approval for these funds. And then if you do need approval, it's through grants management. Again, as I said before, include your PO, your program officer, program director, in that you're seeking this. Before doing the carryover request, a final financial report needs to be submitted through your institution. That is submitted within 120 days after the ending of the funding segment. And it includes all the financial expenditures you had in that period. So if you want to get that carryover early, you're sort of at the mercy of the institution, because they usually will take that 120 days. Now, I don't know if I've had luck at the U of A. Sometimes they do it 90 days. And because you can't ask for the carryover until that's submitted, because that's basically said we've accounted for everything they've spent on this grant for this year. This is what they have left over. They'll work on that with you. You'll have to sign off and say that you concur that that's the amount. And then your carry forward requests can go in once the the FFR has been accepted. Sometimes there's specific deadlines. We get specific deadlines for Apache that FFR goes in, and now we have, a month or so later that we can ask for carryover. After that, they don't want any requests. That's not always the case with all sponsors, but again, asking your grants management officer or program officer, or Maria and I are happy to try to help you figure that out. So what does a request entail? You have to show that there's an actual need for those funds. You can't do overlaps. So if you're asking for something in the current year, you can't use carry forward funds from the previous year for that same amount. You can't duplicate. Okay. So it kind of has to be newer things that are going to enhance the work that you're doing on this project. So the justification for this is, why weren't the funds spent in the past? So that's the first thing you're going to explain. Why did I end up having funds left over? And, in the past years, a lot of us have had issues because there wasn't travel with COVID. So that was one of it. Will the proposed use of these funds result in the change of scope of work? And then explain what the additional work will be done using those funds. So you'll want to show how using those funds will actually accelerate getting this grant done and getting more done, and more staff may be hired, or effort increased, or more assays being run. And you need to justify if the request is essential. If you don't get these, you want to explain how that will affect the grant. And maybe what has occurred is there are new costs that were previously unforeseen. And so you'd like to use carry forward funds for something that you didn't realize was going to come up in your project. And finally, how will the work that you do in the carry forward, using the carry forward funds, impact the work, and what would happen if you don't have it? So that's what they're now requesting, that a justification for carry forward funds entails. And there's a NIH policy for it now, so it's pretty easy to find and know what you have to include in that request. So that being said, though, it's never guaranteed. In the previous years before COVID, basically our sponsor was like, don't even request carryover funds. They were really unhappy with people who did, and thought that it just meant they didn't need those funds. And that's the risk you run is saying, you know, I didn't actually need these funds. I asked for them and I actually need them. So it's a risk. But if you do, you need really good justification for why you have those. And then, you know, looking to the future, especially if you're coming to the end of the grant, pace the new grant submissions ahead of your grant ending. I mean, it's kind of obvious to say, but you don't want this big gap where that grant's ended and you're still waiting for others. Don't count on carry over being your bridge funding. It can, but again, it's never guaranteed. So that's all I have. If you guys have questions, and again, just if you guys just remember that Maria and I are here to help. I know we're just kind of came at you with a whole lot of stuff. I know everybody's at different points. Some of them have seen these things and some haven't. So, but we're here to help, and so is the Guides shared resource. So, any questions?
Sure, Ron has a question. So I just want to say that was really an excellent presentation. I really, I learned something, and I've been doing this for a lot of years. And my question is, say I have a collaborator over at UCLA, and if I want him to be on my grant as a consultant, you know, I could just pay him a certain amount each year, like $10,000. But if I were to have him come on board my grant as a subcontract, then I would have to pay him $10,000 plus the indirect costs that UCLA would charge.
So basically you're asking the difference of like, why would I do a subcontract versus just having him as a consultant?
Consultant, yes.
Right.
Particularly for an R21, that's a small grant.
Right. So, well, consultants do have limits. And there gets to be a point where now you're talking about affecting their taxes. So, and I don't know where those thresholds are, Ron, but that's some reasoning behind it.
And I'll just chime in as well. Like, Ron, you said this is UCLA, so this is outside the state of Arizona.
Yes.
If this was like your collaborator was from NAU at U of A, that would not be allowed because we're both the state institution. So it would be a required subcontract to buy them out versus, so we'd have to look into what it would be across state, like state lines, as Maria stated, with tax stuff.
Great, thanks.
I have a question,
Mm-hmm.
Gina. Thank you for your presentation. So is there I guess a range of like, so this is related to a subcontractor in terms of like that they would charge. So I'm possibly looking at a situation where bringing on I don't think it's going to be a consultant. I think she's asking, I think this is a contractor. So is there a range or a recommended amount and what I guess are acceptable in terms of like the cost, what they charge for that, the institution?
So are you talking about their personal time, like how much we would charge,
or the indirect indirect rate?
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, the indirect rate.
Yeah. So it's Maria, do you want to
vary? Does it vary?
Yeah, it does vary from institution to institution. And usually the investigators are pretty much tied to whatever their institution. So now that being said, I mean, that's, you know, some don't have that. Whether, you know, we run into this with our community partners and they're, well, what's the indirect? And we try to advise them that, you know, that is something that they can charge so that, you know, so to set up, like it's gonna cost them something or someone to manage getting those funds and how they're distributed, et cetera. So it ranges, but you know, the universities or whatever, they've they've negotiated and they have a pretty hard line as to what their indirects are.
So it kind of depends on your funding announcement that you're responding to as well, because they could have stipulations on what's an allowable F&A rate. So
Okay.
looking there first, and then secondly is NAU has their federally negotiated rate that they are allowed to charge, which is the 52%. But if you're talking about the other person, the subcontractees,
Yeah.
if they don't have a federally negotiated rate, NAU allows up to 10%, and that's in their subcontract documents, subrecipient documents on the sponsored projects website.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll look at that. Thank you for that.
Lori or Kelly, I know you put the survey in the chat. Did you want to say anything about that? Or
yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Lori. I'm a program evaluation coordinator for NACP. I put a link in the chat. Ignore the first link. It's the second link. I apologize about that. And it's going to take you 5 minutes. It's anonymous, and it just lets us know like how we're doing with guides, what we can do better, things like that. Thank you so much.
Do we have any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I just want to echo that when you're working on budgets or have financial questions, is that you really do reach out to get people to help you and to answer questions for you. We have a lot of resources at both universities, of very experienced finance people, and before you submit something, there's a different part of the university that's involved. When you're processing the payment, that's another part of the university that's involved. Your own departments, your own colleges are all involved. And so it actually is taking a lot of different people to do different things with your grants. And so the more that you reach out to them, the more that they get to know you, and you're establishing these relationships. And so even those are really important, that we're not just acting when we're in crisis, but that we're also just utilizing the expertise that exists and not getting frustrated because you don't understand something. But really, if you know something's going to be pending, the sooner you start working on it, the better, even if it's months in advance, because some of these processes, as were described by the Marias, take a really long time and can really hold up your project if you're waiting for things to be approved or to be processed. And it doesn't hurt to be asking, you know, I submitted this, where is it at? Because sometimes it does get stuck in somebody's queue, and by you asking, you're making the process go that much smoother. And so don't feel that you're being an inconvenience to somebody. They're there to serve you. And so really utilize that support that you have available to you.
And just to reiterate what Francine said, Maria and myself are both resources, even if it's not about NACP related. I mean, we'll do our best to help you and put you with the right people who can help with that process if we don't know how to help you.
This was a great topic, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be here for the full session. I had another conflicting meeting, but I will watch the recording. And in addition to Francine's great advice, not to wait until the last minute, I have a question, and it might be more, certainly more pertinent to the U of A side of things. But I'm wondering if Maria, Pravat, you have a sense or are part of any conversations at the university level about making participant payments a little bit more friendly for communities and also for the investigators. I am dreading, I have an operational advance that I have to reconcile, and you know, I don't ever feel right putting that responsibility of taking on an operational advance. I don't think staff should have that responsibility. This is just my own, I'm soapboxing now. But anyway, I'm wondering if you're part of any conversations at the university level about making this a little bit easier for everybody involved.
Yeah, I mean, I clearly see that it needs to, and I know what, and we run into this a lot, like you said, with our community members. There's a lot to ask for them to pay for things ahead of time if things can't be reimbursed. I'm not part of any conversations, but I definitely am part of the frustration, Julie, because I see it constantly. I don't know, Francine, if you've maybe problem solved through some of this. I know what you're saying is, just know ahead of time and try to, forewarn, but it is very frustrating to do. And it doesn't, like I said, with other things, it doesn't always make sense to them. Why we have these rules for the grants or the institution, because that's not what their workplace or, but I don't know, Francine, do you have any thoughts there? Because it is, I know you've done this a lot.
So one of the things to keep in mind, and that's why it's important to reach out to entities within the university, is that a lot of department and colleges add layers to the processes, and that's for their own accounting systems and their own kind of how they hand off work projects within their departments. And I've been learning recently that the university is pretty straightforward in what it asks for and why it's asking for different pieces of information. And sometimes our departments have made them a lot more complicated than they have to be. And so it's helpful to reach out to other parts of the university, because they'll say, no, that's not needed. I mean, that's just really going above and beyond, especially when we're thinking about community engaged work, is that they'll say, no, that's not needed. I mean, I'm sorry, we don't want to bother people. We just need for them to be doing this to confirm that they did receive the money or that they did do this and XYZ. And they'll minimize the process quite dramatically. And then I just then submit the documentation to say, I spoke with so-and-so, this is all I need. And so can we get this moving forward? And so I've been doing a lot of that, just really researching what's really required, because I'm learning more and more that a lot of it is embellished. And so I think just really understanding what the purpose behind the different requirements are, and you'll learn, and I'm learning, is that it really is streamlined. And it's just that throughout, because everybody's operating in their own silos, there's a lot of, I think, room for people to be creative in how they're requiring things. And it just adds a lot of burden to the researchers that quite honestly, I don't think needs to be there.
Thank you.
Well, again, if you guys have any questions later or just help or, need to find somebody, just because Maria and I have been around for a while, please reach out to us and we'll try to help you. I mean, it's in our best interest as an ACP for you to succeed, and we don't want you pulling your hair out. So we'd like to help.
Well, I guess in the interest of time, we'll wrap up.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you.
Really an excellent presentation, very informative.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.